Some rules govern daily visible behavior, clothing, covering, conduct, but others shape invisible aspects of women's existence so fundamental that Amish women themselves may not recognize them as restrictions rather than natural order. These 10 regulations remain unspoken because questioning them threatens community foundations. Sexuality control. Amish women receive virtually no education about their own bodies, sexuality, or reproductive health before marriage. The deliberate information void creates ignorance that serves as a control mechanism, ensuring compliance with community expectations about sexual behavior. Young girls learn only that certain body parts are shameful and must stay covered. Menstruation receives minimal explanation, often creating fear and confusion when it begins. Many Amish girls believe they're dying or seriously ill when their first period arrives because mothers provide inadequate preparation. Sexual education doesn't exist. The wedding night often represents the first time an Amish woman learns anything about physical intimacy, and that knowledge comes through direct experience rather than explanation. This ignorance isn't accidental, but intentional. Women who don't understand their bodies can't advocate for themselves or recognize when treatment becomes abusive. Discussion of sexual matters, even between married women, remains taboo. Questions about pain during intercourse, lack of pleasure, or physical problems go unaddressed because talking about these issues is considered immodest and inappropriate even in private female conversations. Reproductive coercion. Birth control in any form remains absolutely forbidden in Amish communities, creating a situation where women have no control over their reproductive lives from marriage until menopause. The average Amish woman bears 8 to 12 children with pregnancies closely spaced, often nursing one infant while pregnant with the next. This perpetual cycle of pregnancy and nursing spans approximately 20 years of a woman's life with no breaks or choice about timing. Requests to limit family size for health reasons typically receive rejection from both husbands and church leaders. The theological position holds that children represent blessings from God, and preventing pregnancy constitutes rejecting divine gifts. Women's physical exhaustion, mental health struggles, or medical complications rarely justify contraception in communities that view suffering as strengthening faith. Some Amish women secretly use rhythm method or other natural family planning approaches, but even these limited attempts at spacing pregnancies must remain hidden because discussing them implies unwillingness to accept as many children as God provides. The physical toll of constant pregnancy proves enormous, but gets dismissed as normal female experience, requiring endurance rather than medical intervention or reproductive choice. Emotional expression. Amish culture deeply suppresses emotional expression, particularly for women whose feelings receive even less validation than men's emotions in communities that value stoicism and submission over authentic emotional processing. Women experiencing depression, anxiety, or emotional distress from demanding lives, abusive relationships, or overwhelming responsibilities find no acceptable outlets for these feelings. Mental health doesn't exist as a recognized concept in most Amish communities, with psychological struggles interpreted as spiritual weakness requiring more prayer rather than professional help. Crying in front of others brings shame rather than comfort. Women suffering must maintain composed exteriors, regardless of internal pain, because emotional displays indicate insufficient faith or failure to accept God's will with proper submission. The suppression extends to positive emotions too. Excessive happiness, excitement, or joy receives discouragement as potentially leading to pride. Women must maintain an even emotional temperament that never veers too far towards sadness or happiness, creating constant internal monitoring and suppression. This emotional restriction prevents women from processing trauma, grief, or ongoing stress in healthy ways. The absence of therapy, support groups, or even permission to discuss feelings with friends creates psychological pressure with no release valve. Many Amish women internalize their pain so deeply they lose the ability to identify their own emotions, believing that numbness represents proper spiritual submission. Intellectual limitation. Education for Amish girls ends at 8th grade, but the intellectual limitation extends far beyond formal schooling to encompass deliberate restrictions on knowledge, curiosity, and mental development that would threaten traditional gender roles. Girls receive less academic attention than boys, even during their limited school years. Teachers, often young Amish women themselves with eighth-grade educations, focus more on preparing girls for domestic roles than developing their intellectual capabilities. Reading instruction emphasizes biblical texts and practical household manuals rather than literature that might expose students to different worldviews. Questions that demonstrate excessive curiosity, particularly about the outside world or theological matters, receive discouragement rather than encouragement. Girls learn early that intellectual ambition represents pride and unfeminine behavior that makes them unsuitable wives. Access to books remains heavily restricted, with community libraries containing only approved texts that reinforce Amish values. Women caught reading unapproved materials face discipline for exposing themselves to dangerous ideas that might undermine their acceptance of traditional roles. The intellectual limitation isn't just about preventing education, but about cultivating minds that don't question, analyze, or imagine alternatives to prescribed life paths. Critical thinking represents a threat to a system requiring unquestioning obedience. Social isolation. Amish women experience profound social isolation that extends beyond the obvious separation from mainstream culture to include restrictions on relationships within their own communities that prevent solidarity, support networks, and collective recognition of shared struggles. Friendships between women receive scrutiny and limitation. Close female friendships might create loyalty competing with primary obligations to husbands and domestic duties. Women spending too much time together raise suspicions about what they might discuss beyond approved topics like recipes and childcare. Visiting other households requires husband's permission and typically happens only for work-related activities like quilting bees or canning sessions that accomplish productive tasks while women socialize. Pure social visits without productive purpose seem frivolous and get discouraged. The isolation prevents women from comparing experiences and recognizing patterns of mistreatment or unreasonable demands as systemic rather than individual problems. Each woman believes her struggles are unique, personal failures rather than consequences of oppressive system affecting all women in the community. Contact with non-Amish women is heavily restricted and monitored. Conversations with outsiders might expose Amish women to information about women's rights, domestic violence resources, or alternative life possibilities that community leaders work hard to keep hidden. The social isolation creates dependency, where women have nowhere to turn for support beyond family members and church leaders who benefit from maintaining current power structures. Escape becomes psychologically impossible when you've been prevented from forming relationships outside the system controlling you. Economic dependency. Amish women possess no economic independence, creating vulnerability that makes leaving abusive situations or asserting any autonomy essentially impossible, regardless of circumstances. Women don't own property, maintain bank accounts, or control household finances. All economic resources belong to husbands who determine how money gets spent without consulting wives about financial decisions affecting the entire family. Work that women perform, uncross, cooking, cleaning, childcare, gardening, sewing, food preservation, generates enormous economic value but receives no compensation. The labor sustains households but creates no independent income or savings that women could access if circumstances required leaving. Some Amish women sell quilts, baked goods, or crafts, but the income typically goes directly to husbands who decide how these earnings get used. Women don't negotiate prices, manage customer relationships, or control the business aspects of their own productive labor. This economic dependency means that women fleeing abusive marriages leave with literally nothing: no money, no credit history, no job skills recognized in outside economy, and no financial resources to establish independent households. The system ensures that even women recognizing their situations as untenable face practical impossibility of leaving because economic survival outside Amish communities requires resources they've been systematically prevented from accumulating. Young women receive no financial education beyond basic household budgeting skills. ensuring they remain dependent on male relatives from birth through father dependency until marriage transfers that dependency to husbands. Physical autonomy. Amish women's bodies are controlled by community standards, religious mandates, and male authority to a degree that eliminates virtually all personal autonomy over physical existence. Dress codes dictate exact clothing requirements down to specific colors, fabrics, and construction methods. Women cannot choose to dress differently, even in private, because modest covering requirements apply constantly. The physical experience of wearing heavy, restrictive clothing, regardless of temperature, activity, or personal comfort, reinforces bodily submission. Hair remains uncut throughout life, creating maintenance burden that consumes significant time daily. Women cannot choose shorter styles that might reduce labor or express individual aesthetic preferences. Medical decisions rest with husbands rather than women themselves. Even gynecological care and reproductive health decisions require husbands' approval, with women often unable to seek treatment for painful conditions or medical issues without male permission. Physical labor expectations ignore women's bodily limitations or exhaustion. Pregnancy, illness, or injury don't excuse women from full domestic workloads. The expectation of perpetual physical availability for cooking, cleaning, childcare, and sexual relations, regardless of personal physical state, treats women's bodies as resources for others' benefit rather than vessels deserving care. Women in pain, experiencing medical emergencies, or suffering chronic conditions often go untreated because seeking medical care requires husband's consent and financial resources he might refuse to provide. Spiritual authority. Despite Christianity's central message about direct relationship with God available to all believers, Amish women access spiritual authority only through male intermediaries who control their religious understanding and expression. Women cannot speak in church services, teach mixed-gender Bible studies, or offer theological interpretations that differ from male leadership positions. Their spiritual insights, questions, and religious experiences receive validation only when filtered through husbands' or male church leaders' approval. Confession of sins happens to male church leaders who decide appropriate penance and restoration paths. This creates situations where women must reveal intimate details of failures, struggles, or sins to men who may be friends with husbands or have vested interests in maintaining the status quo. Religious doubt or questions about theological positions get interpreted as spiritual weakness, requiring correction rather than legitimate intellectual and spiritual inquiry. Women experiencing crises of faith have no safe spaces to process these struggles without facing discipline. The spiritual hierarchy teaches women that they are spiritually inferior to men, requiring male guidance to understand God's will properly. This theological position justifies all other restrictions by framing male control as divinely ordained protection rather than oppression. Women's prayer, worship, and faith get filtered through the lens of submission that conflates obedience to men with obedience to God.